Folks, do you remember when you could trust the news? Do you remember those days? Do you remember when there were trusted news anchors that actually researched what they presented each night, and they felt that journalistic integrity was just somehow important? Do you remember those days? Do you remember peer-reviewed literature? Back in the day, when an expert wrote a book or they published an article, they were held to a high standard by other experts in their field, or in the very least, some kind of editor. I used to have professors in seminary who, if you asked a question that was outside of their expertise, they would, with absolute humility, say, "I don't know the answer to that. You should probably ask Dr. So-and-so." And we're talking about a question about Revelation asked of a Luke scholar, so still in the exact same field of Bible. But it just seems that the more they knew about a topic, the more they knew how little they knew about other topics as well. And I had one professor who worked on the Jesus Seminar, and he was actually an expert on John the Baptist. And so if anybody had a question about John the Baptist, if you were writing a book and you had a section on John the Baptist, or you were writing an article and it was an academic article, this was the guy that you talked to, because he was the world's leading expert on John the Baptist. He was in his field. And I miss those days, don't you? The story is told that Henry Augustus Rowland, who was a professor of physics at Johns Hopkins University, was once called as an expert witness at a trial. Now, during the cross-examination, the lawyer on the other side said, "What are your qualifications in this case?" Now, the normally modest and retiring professor replied quietly, saying, "I am the greatest living expert on the subject under discussion." Now later, a friend who was very well acquainted with Rowland's disposition expressed his surprise at the professor's uncharacteristic answer. And Rowland answered, "Well, what did you expect me to do? I was under oath." To be clear, not every expert is faultless or above reproach. Nor was any newscast back in the day, or any article perfect or free from bias. I'm not saying that. There is no such thing as an unbiased perspective. Human error and, of course, cultural or personal biases always play a part in everything we say and everything we print, even if we try to rise above it. But at least we tried. We tried. And we expected people to do their very best to present facts as they were. And so Walter Cronkite could sign off every night with the phrase, does anyone know it? "And that's the way it is." I can't imagine anyone really saying that today. Well, actually, everybody is saying that. Somebody in his parents' basement writing a blog says, "This is the absolute truth. You can trust me. I'm an expert." These days, it can be really difficult to discern the way it really is. It can be exceedingly difficult to sift through everything and try to figure out what the truth is. And so I think that Edward R. Murrow is more appropriate for today, because he signed off with good night and good luck. Good luck sifting through millions of self-published websites and self-proclaimed experts and arriving at any semblance of the truth. Good luck locating a news source that is at least trying to be unbiased. Good luck finding certainty in uncertain times. Now, is there anything at all that we can point to these days and say, this here is true? And I believe this with all my heart. And when everything else seems confusing or conflicted, I know that this here is the truth upon which I can stand. Now, according to Luke, that is exactly why he wrote his gospel. He wrote it in a time of great uncertainty so that people could have something certain to hold on to. He begins his letter this way: many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. Many people have been writing, he says. I acknowledge that. I'm not the first. Just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. A lot of people are around writing what they've heard, or they've heard directly from people who saw it themselves, he writes. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. The certainty of the things you have been taught. If I were to give you a piece of paper, a blank piece of paper, and I said to you, I'd like you to write down 10 things that you are certain are true. Not things you believe are true, but things you actually know are true. How long do you think it would take to fill that list? Now, what if we said we need 20 foundational truths? How long would that take? And I don't mean inconsequential stuff like my husband will always put the milk away empty, or when my grandkids come to visit, they're always going to have a cold and pass it on to me. I'm not talking about stuff like that. I'm talking about foundational truths like my partner is completely devoted to me. And I know that. Heaven when I die. Now, it is a worthwhile exercise asking yourself this question and making this list, because at the end of the day, you might just discover that you are less certain about more things than you first thought. So over the next few months, I'd like to take us through the Gospel of Luke to mine out certain truths that we can hold on to. And my goal, it's not to indoctrinate you, but to help you discern what you truly believe about God, about life, and about yourself. So, it's going to take us a little while. It's going to take us a little while to get through this. It's going to take 4 months, which is going to take us just a little bit past Easter, and we're not going to cover the entire book of Luke. Instead, I've gone through and I've chosen 17 different passages along the way. I want you to think of this as a cross-country trip where you stop at all the major roadside attractions. Do you like to do that? I like to do that on a road trip, like the giant toonie in Campbellford or the oversized nickel in Sudbury. We're going to pause along the way and explore what God is saying to us as we journey through Luke's gospel. And I hope that you find it not just challenging, but also inspiring. Now, the reason that I chose the book of Luke and not Matthew, Mark, or John, or some other book of the Bible, is because Luke is writing to an audience not too unlike ourselves. He's writing to people who need certainty in uncertain times. You see, Luke was probably written sometime in the early 60s. And I don't mean the groovy 1960s. He didn't wear bell-bottom pants as he wrote this, or have flower patches. No, we're talking the actual 60s. Now, some scholars, to be fair, will date it in the 70s, 80s, 90s, or even in the next century. But the reason that Luke is traditionally dated to the early 60s is because Luke followed up his gospel with a book known as the Acts of the Apostles. So we have basically a 2-volume set, Luke and Acts, which represents over 25% of the New Testament. And the book of Acts records in it, well, the Acts of the Apostles, funny enough. It records the escapades of guys like Peter and James and Paul. And it ends in chapter 28 with Paul alive and well and preaching in Rome. Now, seeing that the Apostle Paul died in the year 65, it probably would have been pretty callous of Luke to not record the death of his friend and his mentor had he died before he'd written. And so it seems like a compelling argument to me and to many others that Acts was written before certain events which would have naturally been included had it been written later. For example, we have the death of Paul, as I mentioned, in AD 65. The death of Peter, sometime around that time period as well, in the mid-60s. James, we think, either died in 62 or 69. There's some discrepancy on that one. There was a huge Jewish-Roman war. In 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. That's a pretty big fact that doesn't make it into the account of Acts. So either there's a second volume we never heard of, or it just hadn't happened yet. And finally, there was a great fire in Rome in AD 64. No mention of these things. But all that being said, even if the book was not written in the early 60s, even if it was written in the 70s and 80s, it doesn't change the reason for Luke's writing, which he outlines in verses 3 and 4. He writes so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. And so I think the question is, why? And why now? Why wait 30 years after the death of Christ to finally get things on the public record? Well, in his commentary on the book of Luke, N.T. Wright gives us this perspective. He says, imagine a village in ancient Palestine. They didn't have printed books or newspapers, televisions, or radio. They had official storytellers. Some great event would happen, an earthquake, a battle, the visit of an emperor. Within a day or two, the story would be told all around the village, and it would settle into a regular form. Everyone would know the story. But some of the better storytellers in the village would be recognized by the others as the right people to tell it. And that's what they do. They wouldn't change the story or modify it. If they did, people would notice and they would quickly set them straight. Perhaps the closest we get to this in the modern Western world is when a family tells a story or an anecdote, often with everybody else knowing what's coming. Do you ever talk to maybe an older married couple, been married for a little while, and the husband starts to tell the story, and he'll say, well, I remember it was last Wednesday, and we were walking down the street, and the wife will interject with, actually, it was last Tuesday. Oh, yeah, that's right, it was last Tuesday. We're going to visit Marcia and Greg. Actually, we were going to visit Jeff and Steve. You ever experienced that before? The correcting that goes on? Well, let me tell you, back in the day, if a storyteller changed anything, that's exactly what would happen. You're not getting the story right. In the same way, you don't change the words of your national anthem. You don't change the words of songs that you sung as a child. There's some songs in my head that I learned as a kid that I learned wrong, actually. It wasn't wrong, they were just changed for the context. And to this day, I can't sing them any other way because that's just how ingrained they are in my psyche. So when Luke went around the villages of Palestine and Syria in the second half of the first century, listening to the stories of these accredited storytellers, the stewards of the word, he will call them, he would know that he was in touch with solid, reliable evidence that went right back to the earliest events. Plato had said 500 years earlier that there was actually a danger in writing things down. Human memories, he thought, were the best way to get things right and to pass them on. And that is so difficult for us to understand. In our print-centric society, it is just impossible for us to wrap our heads around it. This way of thinking that people can be trusted over the testimony of a written word. But here's what Plato would say. He would say, you can give me a book and I have no idea where it came from. But a man looks me in the eye and tells me his story, and I know if he's telling me the truth. So, knowing this context, knowing that this is how they felt about the written word, why is Luke writing all of this down now? Why, after all this time, has he put it into print? Well, the 60s were a turbulent time. And truth be told, the decades after weren't exactly breezy either. But the main reason Luke was writing things down after all of this time is because the message of Jesus had begun to spread far and wide, far beyond the borders of the original communities where Jesus first ministered. I mean, Luke had traveled with the Apostle Paul. He had personally watched Paul bring the message of Christ to many, many cities outside of the regions of Israel. He knew that the word was spreading fast, and that's a good thing. But the question is, what word was spreading? Was it the word of the trusted stewards, or your cousin Bob, who half listens to the news and then gets every detail wrong about current events when he tells you about them at Thanksgiving dinner? Who was reporting the good news about Jesus? Was it Walter Cronkite, or a guy with internet access and some third-hand stories? Now, Luke is aware that others are putting things on paper, and he has a different audience in mind. And I think this is why he wants to write his particular letter. You see, his letter is aimed at an educated, intelligent, inquiring public beyond the borders of Israel. And who'd better to write this than the only Gentile, which means non-Jewish, author of the Bible, who is himself a doctor, educated. A key to understanding his audience is found in the very first lines of his letter. He writes this letter to the most excellent Theophilus. Now, Theophilus might be a Roman governor or a local official whom Luke has come to know, or it could be a literary device which represents all who would consider themselves a lover of God, since that is literally what Theophilus means in Greek. It means lover of God. Either way, he does indicate that Theophilus has been taught something about Jesus in the past and what it means to follow Christ already. And so perhaps this letter is intended for recent converts who are eager to learn more and to be certain of what they have been taught. Maybe this is you. Maybe you've heard stories about Jesus, even sermons about Jesus from some experts in the field, but you just aren't certain. Or maybe you believe in Jesus, but there are a lot of things in life that raise serious questions for you. Like, if God is good, why does evil exist? Are there many paths to God? What does God want me to do with my life? Will God ever allow the Leafs to win a Stanley Cup? How can you be certain? You see, there's a lot of voices out there these days who claim to know the truth. But with so many competing voices, who can you trust? Well, today let me suggest that you can trust only the one voice when it comes to the mysteries of God. And it's the very same voice who spoke everything into existence. It's the very same voice who said, "Let there be light." And there was light. For it's only the architect of all of this that can tell us what really all of this means. All other sources are just our best guess. In fact, sometimes even our very own hearts may betray us about the truth. As Proverbs teaches us, Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. Now this leads me to a single warning. As we embark upon this journey together, I want to warn you of this. You may not like what you hear. A genuine search for answers might uncover uncomfortable truths that you would rather not know. Ignorance is bliss, after all. So, count the cost before you begin this journey. In his book, Ruthless Trust, Brennan Manning shares the story of world-famous ethicist John Kavanaugh. Being an ethicist, there was nothing more that Kavanaugh wanted than clarity. It's all he desired in life. He had dedicated his entire life to its pursuit. And in order to find it, he decided that he must travel to Calcutta to find Mother Teresa. And so he went for 3 months. He worked in a place called the House of the Dying. It was a truly terrible time, but also a great blessing to him. And he was there to find out how he should spend the rest of his life. When he finally met Mother Teresa, he asked her, "Would you please pray for me?" "Well, what do you want me to pray for?" she replied. And then he uttered the request that he had carried thousands of miles. "Pray that I might find clarity." "No," Mother Teresa replied, "I will not do that." When he, in confusion, asked her why, she said, "Clarity is the last thing that you are clinging to and must let go of." When Kavanaugh replied that she always seemed to have clarity, that she always seemed to know what to do next, the very kind of clarity that he was looking for, Mother Teresa simply laughed and said, "I have never had clarity. What I've always had is trust. So I will pray that you trust God." Dear church, before you can find clarity, you must first trust. Trust that the one who will deliver the truth absolutely 100% wants what's best for you and for this world. Until you arrive at that place in your heart and in your mind, you can never accept the truth that you seek, because even if you do find it, you are apt to reject it. But when you come to God in humility, seeking truth in faith, then and only then are you ready to receive what the Lord has to say. And then and only then can you find uncertainty or certainty in uncertain times. And that's just the way it is. Let us pray.